The detonation cord lay coiled in Jake McNiece's hands like a prayer he wasn't sure how to say. 3 days of German prison rations had left his fingers trembling, but the cord itself remained intact. 30 feet of lifeline wrapped in torn waterproof sheath. Behind him, the Urte River gurgled past the bridge supports where Wehrmacht supply trucks had been crossing every few hours since his capture. Each convoy carried ammunition toward American positions along the frozen hedgerows of Belgium, December 1944. McNiece pressed his back against the stone wall of a bombed farmhouse, listening to German voices drift from the checkpoint 200 yards away. The words meant nothing to him, but the casual rhythm told him everything. They felt safe here, comfortable enough to laugh and share cigarettes while their prisoners rotted in a chicken wire pen 3 miles behind the lines. 3 days ago, that pen had held him, Private Liebgott, and a terrified kid from the 82nd, whose name McNiece never learned. The makeshift POW camp hadn't been Stalag Luft III or any of the permanent facilities the Red Cross inspected. Just a converted barn, wooden posts, and exhausted German guards who looked as hungry as their prisoners. McNiece had spent 72 hours memorizing patrol schedules, widening a gap in the wire, and planning an escape that everyone else called suicide. When the moment came, only Liebgott had been willing to run. Now McNiece crouched in Belgian mud, 20 yards from the bridge his squad had failed to destroy during their initial assault. The primary demolition kit was long gone, scattered across a hillside during the firefight that led to his capture. But construction work in Oklahoma had taught him how steel failed under pressure, which joints carried the most load, where a small charge could create maximum damage. This bridge didn't need to disappear completely. It just needed to become unusable. A flashlight beam swept across the approach road, illuminating tire tracks in frozen mud. McNiece counted the passes. Every 10 minutes, the German sentry walked from the eastern checkpoint to the bridge deck, spent 2 minutes examining the supports, then returned to his post. Between patrols, McNiece would have enough time to rig 1 charge, maybe 2 if his hands stopped shaking and the cord held. He thought about the kid from the 82nd who'd refused to escape. "You're crazy, McNiece," he'd whispered through the chicken wire. "They'll shoot us all if you run." The boy might have been right about the shooting, but he was wrong about staying put. Every truck that crossed this bridge carried bullets meant for American paratroopers scattered across the frozen fields of Belgium. McNiece had already failed his squad once. He wouldn't fail them again. The detonation cord felt heavier than its actual weight, loaded with 3 days of planning and the memory of German boots marching him away from his scattered charges. McNiece unwound a section and tested the integrity. Still good, still capable of carrying fire at 21,000 feet per second, enough to turn a supply line into twisted steel and a German convoy into stranded trucks on the wrong side of the river. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The first charge lay buried in a drainage ditch 50 yards from where McNiece had been captured, waterlogged but intact. He'd spent an hour crawling through frozen grass, following landmarks he'd memorized during the original assault on the bridge approach. The satchel's canvas was torn, its straps cut by shrapnel, but the TNT blocks inside remained stable. 2 pounds of explosives, barely enough for the job he had in mind, but enough to make the Wehrmacht engineers think twice about quick repairs. McNiece dragged the charge toward the bridge's eastern support, keeping low as German voices echoed from the checkpoint. The conversation had shifted from casual banter to something more focused. He caught fragments, Amerikanische, Patrouille, Morgen früh, and realized they were discussing morning patrols. Whatever time he had was running out faster than expected. The steel support beam felt like ice against his bare hands as he worked to position the charge. Every sound seemed amplified in the December night, the scrape of his boots on concrete, the whisper of detonation cord uncoiling, his own ragged breathing. The cord would need to stretch across 40 feet of open ground to reach the detonation point he'd selected, a spot far enough from the German checkpoint to avoid immediate discovery, close enough to the river to mask the sound of his retreat. Behind him, footsteps crunched on gravel. McNiece froze, his hand still pressed against the cold steel, counting heartbeats until the German sentry's flashlight beam swept across the bridge deck above his head. 10 minutes had passed already. The patrol schedule he'd memorized in the prison camp was holding true, German efficiency extending even to guard rotations in a backwater supply crossing. The sentry paused directly overhead, and McNiece heard the distinctive click of a cigarette lighter. For 30 seconds, the German soldier stood motionless, smoking and studying the dark river below. McNiece pressed himself against the concrete foundation, barely breathing, while tobacco smoke drifted down through the steel lattework. One careless glance downward would end everything. When the footsteps finally moved away, McNiece resumed his work with hands that shook from more than cold. The charge needed to be positioned exactly, too high, and it would damage the deck without affecting structural integrity. Too low, and the blast would dissipate into the riverbank. He'd blown enough bridges in Normandy to know that precision mattered more than explosive tonnage, especially when working with salvaged equipment and frayed detonation cord. A second charge waited somewhere in the rubble where his squad had scattered their gear during the firefight. McNiece had seen it fall near a stone wall, close enough to retrieve if he could move silently across 30 yards of open ground. 2 charges, properly placed, could drop the central span into the Orthe River and block German supply traffic for days. But retrieving the second charge meant crossing the approach road during the gap between sentry rotations, a calculated risk that could turn his careful planning into a desperate sprint through enemy fire. The second charge lay exactly where McNiece remembered, wedged between loose stones in a wall that had probably been standing since before the war. The TNT blocks were dry, their detonators intact, but the canvas satchel had torn completely away. He cradled the explosives against his chest like an infant, feeling their weight and knowing that 2 charges, carefully placed, could accomplish what his entire squad had failed to achieve 3 days ago. Moving back toward the bridge required crossing the approach road during the patrol gap. McNiece waited until the German sentry's flashlight disappeared around the eastern checkpoint, then sprinted across frozen asphalt in a crouch. His boots made too much noise on the hard surface, but the river's gurgle masked most of the sound. Behind him, a truck engine rumbled in the distance, another convoy approaching from the German rear areas, loaded with supplies for the Bulge offensive. The central span presented a more complex challenge. McNiece needed to crawl across exposed bridge deck while placing the charge against a support girder that was visible from both checkpoints. The damaged detonation cord would barely reach from his planned firing position to both charges, leaving no margin for error. If the sequence failed to detonate properly, he'd be trapped on the wrong side of the river with nowhere to run. He thought about Liebgott, who'd escaped with him but taken a different route toward American lines. The private had questioned McNiece's decision to return to the bridge, arguing that they should focus on reaching friendly forces rather than completing a mission that had already failed once. "Let someone else blow their bridges," Liebgott had said. "You've done enough crazy things for one war." But McNiece knew that someone else was scattered across frozen fields, short of explosives, and facing German armor that was rolling toward them along roads like this one. Every truck that crossed carried ammunition meant for American boys who were already outnumbered and outgunned. The Filthy 13 had earned their reputation by taking jobs nobody else wanted, in places nobody else would go. This bridge was exactly that kind of job. The convoy's engine sound grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive rumble of multiple vehicles. McNiece counted at least 3 trucks, possibly more, approaching the bridge from the east. If he could time the detonation correctly, the charges would drop the span while the convoy was crossing, not to kill the drivers, but to strand their cargo on the wrong side of a river that would take German engineers days to bridge. Working by feel in the darkness, McNiece rigged the central charge to the main support girder. The steel was cold enough to burn his fingers, but he forced himself to work slowly, ensuring the charge was positioned for maximum structural damage. The detonation cord stretched behind him like a lifeline, connecting 2 points of precisely calculated destruction. Everything now depended on timing, luck, and 30 feet of cord that had already survived capture, imprisonment, and escape. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The convoy approached slowly, 3 Wehrmacht supply trucks grinding through the gears as they navigated the approach road's frozen ruts. McNiece crouched 50 yards from the bridge, his improvised detonation device, a flashlight battery and salvaged wire, resting in his trembling hands. The detonation cord stretched across the dark ground like a prayer, connecting him to 72 hours of planning, escape, and stubborn determination to finish what his squad had started. He counted the trucks as their headlights swept across the bridge deck, one loaded with ammunition crates, one carrying fuel barrels, one packed with supplies he couldn't identify from his hiding position. The lead truck moved onto the bridge, its weight causing the steel structure to vibrate slightly. McNiece could feel the vibration through the frozen ground, a subtle rhythm that would disappear when the central span collapsed into the Author River. The German sentry had completed another patrol rotation and returned to the checkpoint, where cigarette smoke glowed orange in the darkness. Casual conversation drifted across the water. Soldiers discussing the convoy, the cold, the rumored American counterattack that everyone expected, but nobody wanted to face. They had no idea that an escaped prisoner lay 30 yards away, thumb resting on a makeshift switch that would turn their supply line into twisted metal and black water. McNiece thought about the kid from the 82nd who'd refused to escape, who was probably still sitting in that chicken wire prison camp outside Bastogne, counting days and hoping the war would end before his luck ran out. The boy had called him crazy, and maybe he was right. A sane man would have used his escape to reach American lines, to report what he'd seen, and let someone else worry about bridges and supply convoys. But sanity was a luxury the filthy 13 had never been able to afford. The second truck rolled onto the bridge deck, followed immediately by the third. All 3 vehicles now sat directly over his carefully placed charges, their combined weight stressing the steel girders exactly as McNiece had calculated. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the trucks might reverse to safety. Too late, and they'd reach the western approach before the charges could bring down the span. He pressed the switch. The detonation cord carried fire faster than thought, a chain reaction of precisely calculated destruction. The eastern charge fired first, sending the support beam spinning into the dark water below. The central span twisted, its girders screaming as tons of steel and concrete surrendered to gravity and the mathematics of structural failure. The second charge erupted as the bridge deck tilted, creating a gap that swallowed the lead truck's rear axle and left all 3 vehicles stranded at impossible angles. McNiece watched from his hiding place as German soldiers scrambled from damaged trucks, shouting orders that nobody could follow. The bridge lay in the river like a broken backbone, its steel framework jutting from black water at angles that would take engineers days to clear. 3 trucks sat immobilized on twisted steel, their cargo of ammunition and supplies destined for American soldiers who would never have to face those particular bullets and shells. The secret McNiece never told the intelligence officer who debriefed him 2 days later was simple. For 30 seconds after pressing the switch, he'd been certain he'd killed everyone on that bridge. The charges had fired in the wrong sequence, twisting the steel deck before the trucks could reach safety, and in the darkness he couldn't tell whether the German drivers had escaped their vehicles before the span collapsed into the Author River. He'd planned the detonation to strand the convoy, not to crush it. 2 charges placed for maximum structural damage, time to drop the central span after the trucks had crossed to safety. But the eastern charge had fired late, or the western charge had fired early, and the sequence he'd calculated so carefully had compressed into a moment of twisted steel and vehicles sliding toward black water at angles that made survival seem impossible. For 30 seconds, McNiece crouched in the frozen grass and listened to German voices shouting from the wreckage, and realized he couldn't tell whether they were cries for help or orders for rescue operations. The darkness that had concealed his approach now hid the consequences of his improvised demolition. He'd accomplished the mission, cutting a German supply line that wouldn't be repaired for days, but the cost remained invisible in shadows and echoing voices he couldn't understand. Then flashlights began moving across the twisted bridge deck, and McNiece saw figures climbing from the damaged trucks. The drivers had survived, along with most of their cargo. The bridge was destroyed, exactly as he'd intended, but the human cost was limited to bruises, cuts, and the kind of close call that soldiers carried in their nightmares rather than their graves. The relief hit him like a physical blow, leaving his hands shaking worse than they'd been before the charges detonated. But the relief came wrapped in a darker realization. He'd been willing to kill those drivers if necessary to complete the mission. The mathematics of war had reduced 3 German soldiers to acceptable casualties in his mental calculation, variables to be balanced against American lives that might be saved by cutting this particular supply line. The kid from the 82nd had been right about one thing. McNiece was crazy, or at least crazy enough to make decisions that would live in his memory long after the bridge was rebuilt. He'd watched the German soldiers work through the night, rigging ropes and pulleys to salvage what they could from the stranded trucks. Professional competence under pressure, the same kind of improvised problem-solving that kept American units functioning when plans fell apart and equipment failed. The enemy wore different uniforms, but shared the same stubborn determination to complete impossible jobs with inadequate resources. When Allied forces retook the area 48 hours later, they found McNiece sitting beside the destroyed bridge, still holding the frayed end of detonation cord. He'd waited through German patrols, artillery bombardments and airstrikes, too exhausted to move and too stubborn to leave before friendly forces arrived. The official report described his actions as exemplary initiative under extreme conditions, but said nothing about the 30 seconds when he'd believed himself capable of casual murder in the name of tactical necessity. The after-action report filed by Regimental Intelligence reduced McNiece's 3-day odyssey to 4 sentences. Staff Sergeant McNiece escaped enemy custody and successfully destroyed the Author River Bridge, disrupting German supply operations for 48 hours. Charges placed with precision under adverse conditions, no friendly casualties, recommend commendation for initiative and resourcefulness. The paper said nothing about chicken wire prison camps, 72 hours of memorizing guard rotations, or detonation cord that barely reached far enough to complete a sequence that had almost gone catastrophically wrong. McNiece read the report 6 months later in a field hospital outside Hagenau, recovering from wounds that had nothing to do with bridges or escaped prisoners. The clinical language felt like someone else's story, stripped of cold steel against bare hands, German voices drifting through winter darkness, and the 30 seconds when he'd believed himself capable of killing 3 men to complete a mission. The report mentioned his exemplary initiative, but ignored the calculations that reduced enemy soldiers to acceptable variables in a tactical equation. The kid from the 82nd had been liberated when American forces overran the prison camp 2 days after McNiece's escape. He'd survived the war, rotated home to a family farm in Nebraska, and never spoke about the crazy demolition sergeant who'd crawled through a gap in chicken wire rather than wait for proper liberation. Sometimes McNiece wondered whether the boy had been right, whether survival was more important than the stubborn completion of missions that might have succeeded or failed regardless of one man's decision to keep fighting. But the mathematics work differently now. 30 years after the Author River Bridge had been rebuilt, and German supply convoys had become a historical footnote. McNiece could calculate the tons of ammunition that hadn't reached German positions, estimate the American casualties that might have been prevented by 48 hours of disrupted logistics. The numbers suggested that his escape and demolition had been worthwhile, even necessary. But numbers couldn't account for the weight of being willing to kill 3 strangers because their uniforms made them tactical problems rather than human beings. The detonation cord itself had disappeared somewhere in the field hospital's laundry, probably incinerated with other gear too damaged or contaminated to salvage. McNiece had kept it through 2 more campaigns, carrying 30 feet of frayed cord like a talisman that connected him to the night when everything had depended on improvised explosives and a switch made from flashlight batteries. Losing it felt like losing the last physical evidence of decisions he'd made in darkness, choices that had seemed clear at the time, but grew more complicated with each passing decade. In 1974, McNiece stood on a rebuilt bridge over a Belgian river that looked nothing like the twisted steel wreckage he remembered. The Ourthe flowed beneath modern concrete and asphalt, carrying tourist boats rather than supply convoys, connecting communities rather than serving strategic objectives. Traffic moved smoothly across the span without recognition that this particular crossing had once been the site of escape, demolition, and the kind of desperate improvisation that turned frightened young men into legends they struggled to recognize. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.